From the towering Wasatch Mountains in the heart of the American Southwest, welcome to this episode of Undiscovered Utah. This show focuses on the mysteries, forgotten places, rugged landscapes, and sometimes deadly history of the American Southwest. I'm your host, Neil, and tonight's show is a fascinating story of one of the most intriguing women in Utah history. December 1963. At the end of a lonely road in northeastern Utah stood a small log cabin surrounded by sandstone cliffs, livestock pens, fruit trees, and the remnants of a working ranch. There was no telephone inside, no electric light, no indoor plumbing. The nearest town was miles away, beyond two canyons and a long stretch of really rough country. Inside, or perhaps outside that cabin, an elderly woman suffered a terrible fall. Some accounts say she slipped. Others say one of her horses knocked her down. Whatever happened, the result was the same. Her hip was broken. The injured woman was nearly 90 years old, but she was not accustomed to waiting for someone else to rescue her. She had spent half a century living in this canyon, raising livestock, irrigating crops, cutting firewood, and repairing fences, and surviving winters that would have driven many people away. Her name was Josephine Bassett Morris. Most people called her Josie. During her long life, she had known cowboys, cattle rustlers, and members of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. She had married several times, divorced repeatedly, raised two sons, operated ranches, made liquor during Prohibition, hunted deer when the law said she should not, and stood trial after neighboring cattlemen accused her of stealing and butchering their livestock. Yet the most remarkable part of Josie's story may not be the outlaw legends surrounding her. It may be the simple fact that she found a place at Cup Creek and built a life there almost entirely on her own terms. Josie survived the initial injury, but complications followed. In May of 1964, after approximately 90 years of life, the last great chapter of the Browns Park frontier came to an end. Tonight we're traveling to Cub Creek country of Dinosaur National Monument. Not primarily to talk about dinosaur bones, ancient rock layers, or the famous Wall of Bones. Instead, we are following a narrow road east of the quarry, deep into the monument, until the pavement ends beneath a grove of trees. There, at the mouth of two shadowed box canyons, stands a cabin of Josie Bassett Morris. Visitors today see a modest logged house. Nearby are the remains of a chicken coop, irrigation works, livestock structures, an orchard, and the other fragments of a once active homestead. Short trails enter Hog Canyon and Box Canyon, where the high walls provide natural enclosures for Josie's animals. It is peaceful today, but during Josie's lifetime, it was not a museum exhibit. It was a working ranch and a place of constant labor, chopping wood, milking cows, feeding chickens, irrigating gardens, preserving food, mending equipment, and preparing for winter. To understand how Josie came to live here, we must begin several hundred miles away in Arkansas, and then follow her family into one of the most isolated communities in the American West. Josephine Bassett was born in Arkansas, most commonly dated January 17, 1874. Her parents were Amos Herbert Bassett, usually called Herbert or Herb, and Mary Elizabeth Bassett. Herbert was an educated man, a Civil War veteran, a reader, and a musician. He suffered from poor health, and his brother Sam encouraged him to travel west, believing the dry mountain air might help him. His wife Elizabeth was very different in temperament. She had been raised in the South, but she proved unusually capable in the rough conditions of the frontier. Accounts describe her as a determined, practical, and willing to assume responsibilities, normally reserved for men. She handled livestock, managed ranching operations, and was reportedly an excellent shot. Josie later summarized the family arrangement very plainly. My mother took the lead in our family and was handy with a shotgun. In 1877, when Josie was about 3 years old, the Bassett family traveled west and settled in Browns Park. Browns Park, also historically known as Browns Hole, is a long isolated valley carved by the Green River, near the meeting point of Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. Mountains and high plateaus surround it. During the 19th century, the difficult approaches and confusing state boundaries made the valley both a refuge and a world of its own. The Bassetts arrived with Josie and her brother Sam. 3 more children followed, Anne, Albert, and George. Anne Bassett, Josie's younger sister, would eventually become famous in her own rights as Queen Anne, one of the West's best-known women ranchers and alleged cattle rustlers. The Bassett's home was unusual for the frontier. The family owned books and musical instruments. Herbert encouraged education and conversations. At the same time, survival required everyone to work. Josie learned to ride, rope, shoot, herd cattle, and understand the landscapes. She also learned the domestic skills expected of a frontier woman: cooking, preserving food, sewing, and caring for visitors. The result was not a woman who rejected every convention. It was a woman who could move easily between different worlds. She could present herself with grace and good manners when necessary, but she could also ride with the cowhands, work cattle, and live for weeks in conditions many men found unbearable. Browns Park has often been described simply as an outlaw hideout, and that is true, but incomplete. Most of its residents were ranchers, farmers, and ferrymen, laborers, and families just trying to survive. The isolation forced people to depend upon one another. A neighbor might be a rival in a dispute or over cattle or water, but that same neighbor might be the only person available when someone became sick, broke a leg, or needed help during a winter storm. The valley developed at its own social code. Cattle rustling was widespread enough that the boundary between borrowing, reclaiming, and stealing an animal could become remarkably flexible. Many residents tolerated theft from wealthy outside cattle companies while strongly condemning violence against local families. The people of Browns Park did not necessarily consider themselves lawless. They often believed that they were following a local form of justice, one adapted to distance, poverty, and the power of large cattle interests. The valley location also made it attractive to fugitives. A rider pursued by authorities in Colorado could cross into Utah or Wyoming. Law officers faced difficult trails, uncertain jurisdictions, and residents who were not eager to answer questions. By 1890, Browns Park had become part of what was later riders called the Outlaw Trail, a loose chain of remote camps and hideouts that included Hole in the Wall in Wyoming and Robber's Roost in southern Utah. Among the men who passed through Browns Park was Liza Lay, Matt Warner, and Robert Leroy Parker, the man better known as Butch Cassidy. Members of the outlaw world sometimes stayed or worked at the Bassett Ranch. They ate at the family table, discussed books with Herbert, and mingled with the Bassett children. Josie, therefore, did not encounter outlaws as distant newspaper characters. She knew some of them as ranch hands, neighbors, visitors, and friends. But this is where the documented history begins to mix with legend. Josie definitely knew Butch Cassidy. Beyond that, the evidence becomes less certain. Later writers frequently portrayed Jessie, her sister Ann, and several members of the Wild Bunch as participating in a complicated series of romances. Some claim that Josie was involved with Liza Lay, Will Carver, and Cassidy himself. One account, based on a late interview by Josie, describes her as meeting Cassidy as a teenager and being immediately impressed by him. Other stories claim that Cassidy later visited her decades after his reported death in Bolivia. But an old National Park Service history offers a much more restrained version. It states that Josie knew Cassidy from Browns Park, but did not claim him as a suitor, and that he never visited her at Cub Creek Cabin. A Bureau of Land Management history offers still another variation. Cassidy reportedly showed interest in Josie, but Josie did not return that interest. Those stories cannot all be completely correct. What can be said with confidence is that Cassidy and other men associated with the Wild Bunch knew the Bassett family and spent time at or near their ranch. Josie belonged to a social world in which the Wild Bunch moved, even if the exact nature of her romantic relationships cannot now be established. The claim that Cassidy secretly survived Bolivia and later visited Josie is particularly difficult to verify. It was repeated by people who interviewed her late in life, but no hard physical evidence confirms the reunion. Although Josie was raised in an isolated valley, her parents did not intend for her education to end with ranch work. Utah historical accounts say that she attended St. Mary's of the Wasatch in Salt Lake City. A federal history also describes Josie and Ann as receiving formal schooling away from Browns Park. The experience would have exposed Josie to a very different world. Structured classes, formal behavior, city life, and the social expectations placed upon young women near the end of the 19th century. But the ranch remained home. Josie returned to a life of cattle, horses, and difficult country. Formal schooling may have sharpened her ability to move within respectable societies, but it did not persuade her to accept a quiet or dependent life. That independence soon became evident in her marriages. Josie's complete married name has sometimes been written as Josie Bassett McKnight Rainey Williams Wells Morris. That's a mouthful. The Standard Modern account says that she married 5 times and divorced 4 husbands. And older National Park Service publications cautions that the number of formal marriages and long-term relationships is not perfectly documented. That uncertainty matters. Divorce records, marriage records, family recollections, and later storytelling do not always align. However, the broad pattern is clear. Josie entered and ended several relationships at a time when divorce carried significant social stigma, especially for women. Her first husband was Jim McKnight, a rancher connected with Browns Park community. They married while Josie was still young and had 2 sons, Crawford and Herbert, who was often called Chick. The marriage didn't last. Stories say Josie drove McKnight away either at gunpoint or after confronting him over his drinking. The exact scene may have grown more dramatic in the retelling, but Josie's own explanation was straightforward. She did not want to live with a drunken man. Later relationships followed. The surviving record associates her with the surnames Rainey and Williams before her marriage to Emerson Wells. Wells' death became one of the darkest and most persistent legends around Josie. He reportedly had a serious drinking problem and died after becoming ill. Some accounts say traces of strychnine or a poisoned container were found nearby. Rumors spread that Josie had poisoned him. Utah state history describes acute alcoholism as the most likely cause of death, while acknowledging the accusations. Other retellings describe an inquiry or court appearances. Whatever the precise legal procedure, no court established that Josie murdered Emerson Wells. The accusation survived because it fit the reputation already forming around her. The capable frontier woman who discarded husbands, handled firearms, and refused to behave as society expected. The legend is memorable. The evidence is inconclusive. Josie's final long-term relationship was with a man named Ben Morris. The details are again uncertain. Some records identify him as her 5th husband. An older park history describes the relationship more cautiously, saying Ben lived with her at Cub Creek and that Josie retained his surname after he left. Popular stories claim Josie eventually chased him away with a frying pan. That story may be true. It may also be one of the humorous details later attached to a woman already famous for dismissing unwanted men. What is certain is that by the time Josie established herself permanently at Cub Creek, the enduring relationships of her life was not with another husband. It was with the land. In 1913, as she approached 40, Josie chose a new beginning. The current National Park Service account says she decided to homestead at Cub Creek that year. Other records place her actual settlement there in 1914. Rather than force the uncertainty the documentation does not support, it is reasonable to say that Josie selected the site in 1930 and began establishing the homestead around 1914. Cub Creek lay east of the town of Jensen, Utah, in a narrow green pocket surrounded by dry sandstone country. A spring emerged near the mouth of a box canyon, providing the water necessary for people, crops, and livestock. The location offered several natural advantages. The canyon walls gave shelter from the wind. Box Canyon and Hog Canyon could function as livestock enclosures, with fencing across the openings. The landscape itself became part of the ranch's infrastructure. The spring could be diverted into ditches. The soil near Cub Creek supported gardens, fruit trees, and field crops, if someone was willing to clear the brush and perform the endless work of irrigation. The property was described as roughly 1 mile long and half a mile wide. To someone passing through, it may have appeared remote and unforgiving. To Josie, it was an opportunity. Homestead required more than occupying land. The claimant had to establish residence, improve the property, and demonstrate productive use before receiving legal title. That meant building shelter, cultivating the ground, and proving that the claim was more than speculation. Josie began with a simple cabin and gradually developed a working ranch. Friends and family helped at different times. Her son Crawford, his wife, and their children lived near for several years. The children spent summers working and playing around the property, while Crawford assisted with livestock and construction. According to the current Utah history and the National Register field documentation, the surviving cabin was constructed in 1924, replacing or enlarging Josie's earlier shelter. An older park brochure gave the later construction date, but more examples of how the records surrounding Josie don't always agree. The finished house was modest. It was a one-story log structure with mud chinking between the logs. Materials such as cardboard and wallpaper helped reduce drafts. A kitchen or shed addition expanded the living space. Later modifications included a more suitable chimney. Around it grew an entire ranch complex, a chicken coop, an outhouse, animal sheds, a barn, a tack shed, corrals, a root cellar, and a small footbridge. Josie planted trees for shade and for fruit. She dug irrigation channels from the spring. She raised gardens, vegetables, feed crops, and fruit orchards. This was not a decorative pioneer cabin. It was a carefully engineered survival system. Josie's day began with work. Animals had to be fed and watered. Cows had to be milked. Chickens needed tending. Wood had to be carried to the house. Fences required constant repair. Irrigation water had to be guided through ditches and directed towards the places where it was most needed. Gardens had to be planted, weeded, and protected from the animals. Then came the harvest. Vegetables and fruits could not simply be left on the table. They had to be canned, dried, or placed in the root cellar. Meat had to be preserved. Josie made jerky, soap, and clothing. She raised cattle, pigs, chickens, and grew feed for her animals. Her spring supplied water, but there was no indoor plumbing. She had no electric power. An older park account mentions a battery-operated radio was one of the few modern devices she eventually accepted. When supplies ran low, Josie traveled by wagon or horseback towards Jensen or Vernal, Utah. The journey required negotiating miles of rough country, then returning with everything she expected to need. Winter made that task even harder. Water froze, snow closed roads, livestock consumed more food. A damaged roof, a broken stove, or a sick animal could become a serious emergency when the nearest help was miles away. Yet Josie remained at Cub Creek for approximately 50 years. Josie's appearance became part of her legend, but her choices were usually rooted in practicality rather than performance. For much of her early life, she wore long skirts expected of women. While clearing brush and working around thorny plants at Cub Creek, those skirts repeatedly snagged and interfered with her movement. So she began wearing pants. For ranch work, she favored bib overalls. When she traveled to town, she wore better cut trousers. She reportedly reserved dresses or skirts for weddings, funerals, and occasions when they served a strategic purpose. Her long, curly hair created similar problems. According to one account, her hair became badly entangled in brush while she was working. She cut herself free and then completed the job with scissors. From that point forward, she wore her hair short. To outsiders, her clothing and haircut appeared rebellious. To Josie, they were efficient solutions to ordinary problems. Josie lived independently, but she was not a hermit. The Bassett family had always welcomed travelers, and Josie continued that tradition. A person passing through could expect coffee, biscuits, a meal, or a place to sleep. Hospitality was not merely a social grace in remote country. It was a part of the survival code. Today's guest might be tomorrow's rescuers. A traveler who received a meal at Josie's table might later help repair a wagon, move cattle, carry news, or bring supplies from town. During the Great Depression, Josie's generosity expanded. Utah historical accounts say she distributed food to people in need. She shared beef, garden produce, and preserved goods. In one remarkable story, she allowed a homeless family to occupy her cabin while she spent the winter living in a dugout. Whether every detail has survived exactly as it happened, the story matches the reputation Josie held among many neighbors. Difficult when crossed, but especially generous when someone genuinely needed help. Josie's self-sufficiency did not always remain within the boundaries of the law. During Prohibition, the production and sale of alcoholic beverages were illegal across the United States. Josie made alcohol anyway. The National Park Service identifies apricot brandy and cherry choke wine among the drinks she produced during the 1920s and into the 1930s. Other accounts describe whiskey and a still. Fruit growing on her property could be fermented or distilled into something that lasted longer and brought more money than fresh produce. Josie reportedly did not drink much of what she made. It was a product, a source of cash, and an item that could be traded. She was apparently never successfully prosecuted for bootlegging. Her willingness to ignore certain laws was not unusual in a world in which she had been raised. Browns Park culture had taught her that legality and morality were not always the same thing. If the law threatened survival or simply seemed unreasonable, Josie made her own decisions about whether to obey it. One of the best-known stories about Josie's involves an illegal deer. After selling much of her cattle, she sometimes hunted to provide meat for herself, her family, or people in need. At least some of that hunting reportedly occurred outside the legal season. According to the story, a game warden arrived at her cabin shortly after she had killed a deer. Josie invited him inside and served him coffee and biscuits. The warden jokingly announced that he had come to arrest her for poaching. Josie apparently failed to recognize the joke. She admitted that she had recently killed a deer and led him directly to the carcass. The warden, now placed in an awkward position by her complete honesty, decided not to arrest her. He issued a warning and then remained for a meal that reportedly included venison gravy. It is a nearly perfect Josie Bassett story. Hospitality, law-breaking, honesty, and survival all mixed together. In 1936, Josie faced a much more serious legal threat. A rancher named Jim Robinson accused her of butchering cattle that did not belong to her and selling the meat in town. 6 other ranchers reportedly joined that accusation. Authorities found cattle hides buried on or near Josie's property. Josie insisted she had been framed. Her neighbors provided bail, demonstrating that despite the accusations, she still commanded considerable loyalty within the community. At trial, Josie understood that appearance mattered. The woman, who normally wore trousers and overalls, arrived at court dressed like a respectable grandmother. She was in her early 60s, gracious in manner, and apparently very effective before the jury. Popular retellings often say she was acquitted twice. The more detail Utah history gives a slightly different account. The first jury failed to reach a verdict. Prosecutors tried her again, and the second jury also deadlocked. After 2 hung juries, the county attorney abandoned the case. That distinction is important. A hung jury is not the same as a formal verdict of not guilty, but the practical outcome is nearly identical. Josie was not convicted, and the prosecution ended. She was innocent? The surviving evidence does not allow a confident answer. Neighboring cattle sometimes wandered onto her land. Josie was known to butcher animals. Hides were reportedly found on the property. But she also had enemies, and local conflicts over cattle could be deeply personal. Josie returned to Cub Creek with her freedom and her reputation intact, or perhaps even enhanced. Josie had occupied and worked her land for decades before fully securing legal title. In 1945, when she was about 71, she hoped to rebuild a profitable cattle operation. She needed financing, but banks were unwilling to lend money to her directly. According to the historical account, she transferred or deeded her land to someone who could obtain a loan. The arrangement went badly. Whether through a misunderstanding, poor legal advice, or deliberate exploitation, Josie lost control of most of her property. After decades of labor, the ranch she had cleared, irrigated, and developed was no longer entirely hers. She retained only a small adjoining parcel, approximately 5 acres, surrounding the cabin. For many people, that loss would have marked the end. Josie remained. She continued living in that cabin for nearly another 20 years. Josie's lifetime spanned an extraordinary period of change. She was born when Ulysses S. Grant was president. She grew up when horseback travel, open range ranching, and isolated settlements were normal parts of Western life. She knew people who traveled the outlaw trail and remembered a time when law enforcement could be evaded simply by crossing a river or state boundary. But she lived long enough to see automobiles, airplanes, the radio, television, interstate highways, and the building of the human spaceflight. While the outside world changed, Josie's daily routine remained tied to the rhythms of water, weather, crops, and animals. By 1950, visitors regarded her as a living connection to a vanished frontier. Interviewers came to hear her stories about Browns Park and Butch Cassidy. Photographers captured her in trousers and overalls, surrounded by the practical objects of ranch life. The attention helped transform Josie from a local rancher woman into a Western legend. That transformation also caused problems. Stories became polished. Anecdotes grew more dramatic. Uncertain relationships became passionate romances. Rumors became accepted fact. The woman herself became increasingly difficult to separate from the character created around her. But beneath the legends remained an aging rancher who still cooked, cared for the animals, tended plants, and welcomed people into her home. When Josie arrived at Cub Creek around 1914, Dinosaur National Monument did not exist. The following year, in October of 1915, President Woodrow Wilson protected 80 acres surrounding the Great Dinosaur Quarry north of Jensen. That original monument did not encompass the vast canyon country people associate with Dinosaur National Monument today. In 1938, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt expanded the monument by roughly 200,000 acres, protecting the canyons of the Green and Yampa rivers and much of the surrounding landscape. Existing private lands remained valid, so Josie continued living on her land even as the federal monument expanded the region around her. She did not become a park employee or a historical interpreter. She remained a working resident. After her death in 1964, her remaining property and cabin were incorporated into the National Monument, and the National Park Service eventually preserved the site as part of the region's homesteading history. In 1986, the Josie Bassett Morris Ranch Complex was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The property preserves more than the cabin. It preserves the relationship between Josie and the landscape. The spring, orchard remnants, irrigation channels, pens, canyon walls, and surviving structures that made her life possible. In December of 1963, Josie's body finally failed her. The accounts differ in detail. One says she tripped, the other says a horse knocked her down. The current National Park account simply records that she suffered a broken hip at her cabin. The precise cause may never be settled. What matters is that the injury was severe. At her age, a broken hip carried enormous risk. Josie initially appeared to improve, but complications developed. She died in May of 1964, approximately 90 years old. She was buried in the Bassett family cemetery in Browns Park, returning in death to the valley where she had learned to ride, ranch, and survive. Her cabin remained at Cub Creek, shaded by trees she had planted and surrounded by the traces of 50 years of work. So who was Josie Bassett Morris? Was she an outlaw? She certainly broke laws. She made illegal liquor. She reportedly hunted out of season. She was accused of stealing cattle, though 2 juries refused to convict her. Was she a gun-wielding husband killer? There is no reliable evidence that she murdered anyone. The poisoning story surrounding Emerson Wells remained an accusation, not an established fact. Was she Butch Cassidy's great love loss? She knew Cassidy. A romance is possible, but the surviving accounts contradict one another. His alleged visit to Cub Creek belongs to legend, unless stronger evidence is discovered. Was she an early feminist? Josie may not have used that word herself, but she controlled her own property, ended marriages she found intolerable, adopted practical clothing, preferred work commonly assigned to men, and maintained her independence well into old age. Was she a heroic pioneer? At times, certainly. But turning her into a flawless hero would distort her as much as turning her into an outlaw queen. Josie could be generous and difficult, respectable and law-breaking, feminine and unconventional, independent, but deeply connected to her family and community. She lived according to the moral code formed in Browns Park, a code shaped less by statutes and courtrooms than by loyalty, necessity, hospitality, and survival. The most revealing evidence of her life may not be found in stories about Butch Cassidy, poisoned bottles, or stolen cattle. It may be found at Cub Creek. A line of an irrigation ditch, an old fruit tree, a livestock fence disappearing into the mouth of a canyon, a root cellar where food was stored through winter, a small log cabin standing beneath the trees. Those things tell us that Josie did not merely pass through this landscape. She studied it, changed it, depended upon it, and for 50 years she made it home. Today's visitors can follow Cub Creek Road approximately 10 miles from the Quarry Visitor Center to the Josie Morris cabin. The cabin, orchard, remnants, and nearby canyon trails remain open as a window into her world, although winter snows can make access difficult. When you stand there, it is easy to understand why Josie stayed. The canyon is isolated, but not empty, harsh, but capable of abundance, and quiet enough that the sound of the spring, the wind, and the cottonwood leaves can make the modern world seem very, very far away. Josie Bassett Morris lived between 2 versions of the American West. One was the West of a dime novel and legends, outlaws, stolen cattle, hidden whiskey, and whispered accusations. The other was the West most people actually experienced, a world of work, weather, family, hunger, debt, generosity, and difficult choices. Josie belonged to both. Perhaps that is why her story remains so compelling. Enjoyed this episode of Undiscovered Utah and the story of Josie. If you get a chance, get out to Dinosaur National Monument out by Vernal and be sure to visit Josie's cabin. Be sure to check out our new website at undiscoveredamerica.org, and let us know what you think of tonight's episode. Drop us an email or send us a message. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe. That helps us stay in business. You can visit our YouTube channel at Undiscovered Utah and watch this episode and see pictures of the cabin and of Josie. Thanks for listening. I'm Neil, JB to many of you. And again, this has been Undiscovered Utah.